Good evening and welcome. I'm Dr. Maren Solis, and I'm glad you've joined us. What you're about to hear is the story of our ocean, where it came from, how it shaped everything we know, and why its history matters today. So, get comfortable and let's dive in. In our last episode, we followed the ocean from its very beginning, from the first rains on a molten, lifeless rock, all the way through the first stirrings of life, the transformation of the atmosphere, and the explosion of complex animals in the Cambrian seas. By around 700 million years ago, the ocean had been alive in one form or another for over 3 billion years. Life had survived the great oxygenation event. It had adapted, it had diversified, and it had, by this point, produced something genuinely new. Animals. Simple ones, to be sure, but animals nonetheless. The world at this time looked quite different from the one we know today. The continents were still in very different positions. There were no fish yet, no forests, no insects, no creatures of any kind living on dry land. The land itself was bare rock. All of the action, all of the complexity, all of the diversity, all of the life was in the ocean. And the ocean was doing well. It was warm, relatively shallow in many places, and home to a growing variety of simple animals, soft-bodied creatures, sponges, early worms, and organisms that we struggle to even classify today because they don't resemble anything alive now. One group in particular is worth mentioning here because their story connects directly to the crisis that was coming. The Ediacarans, named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia where their fossils were first studied in detail, were a collection of soft-bodied organisms that lived in the shallow oceans between about 635 and 540 million years ago. They were flat, frond-like, quilted, or disc-shaped. Many of them looked more like plants or fungi than animals, but the evidence suggests most of them were indeed animals, or at least something very close to animals. They had no shells, no hard parts, no teeth. They mostly sat on the ocean floor or drifted in the water, absorbing nutrients. They were peaceful, strange, and utterly unlike anything alive today. The Ediacarans were, in a sense, the ocean's first real experiment with large, complex, multicellular life. And they were about to be tested in a way that nothing on Earth had ever been tested before. But before we get to the freeze itself, it's worth asking, what does an ocean look like when it's doing well? What was the normal against which Snowball Earth was such a dramatic departure? Because to truly appreciate how catastrophic the events of this episode were, you need to understand what was at stake. The ocean, 750 million years ago, was a warm, productive, sunlit world. Surface waters were rich in nutrients. Microscopic algae and cyanobacteria carpeted the upper ocean, soaking up sunlight and pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. Larger organisms fed on them. The seafloor was covered in microbial mats, sponges, and the soft, strange bodies of the Ediacarans. Warm currents circulated nutrients around the globe. The chemistry of the water was stable. The temperature of the deep ocean was several degrees warmer than it is today. There was nothing, in other words, to suggest that anything was about to go badly wrong. And yet, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world was changing. The stage was being set for the most extreme climate event in the history of our planet. To understand how the Earth froze, you have to understand something about how our planet normally regulates its own temperature. The Earth has a built-in thermostat. It's not perfect, and it works on timescales of millions of years rather than years or decades. But it exists, and it depends, crucially, on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat in the atmosphere. When CO2 levels are high, the planet is warm. When they are low, the planet cools. And the Earth has a natural mechanism for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. When rain falls on exposed rock, the water reacts with the rock's minerals and absorbs CO2 from the air in a process called chemical weathering. That CO2 then gets washed into rivers and eventually into the ocean, where it is absorbed or locked into seafloor sediments. Over millions of years, this process pulls enormous amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere and effectively turns down the planet's thermostat. Around 750 million years ago, something happened that pushed this thermostat to an extreme. Most of the Earth's landmass at that time was grouped together near the equator, close to the regions with the heaviest rainfall. That meant the weathering process was running at full speed, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere faster than volcanoes could put it back. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, CO2 levels began to drop. The greenhouse effect weakened. The planet began to cool. At first, the cooling was gentle. Ice caps formed near the poles, as they do today. But then a feedback loop kicked in. And this is the mechanism that turned an ordinary ice age into something almost unimaginable. Ice is white. White surfaces reflect sunlight rather than absorbing it. So as the ice caps expanded, they began reflecting more and more solar energy back into space. The less heat the planet absorbed, the colder it got. The colder it got, the more ice formed. The more ice formed, the more sunlight was reflected. It was a runaway cycle. And once it reached a certain point, there was almost nothing that could stop it. The ice advanced from the poles toward the equator. It crept across the continents and across the ocean surface. Glaciers thousands of feet thick ground their way across land that had never been cold before. The ocean, which had been warm and productive for billions of years, began to freeze at the surface. First near the poles, then at mid-latitudes, then further and further toward the tropics, until the ice reached all the way to the equator. The timeline of this event is almost impossible to hold in your mind. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a century. It unfolded over millions of years, gradually, relentlessly, unstoppably. But in geological terms, it was extraordinarily fast. The Earth went from a warm, ocean-covered world to an almost completely frozen ball in what amounts to the blink of an eye on a planetary timescale. Scientists believe there were actually at least 2 major Snowball Earth events, possibly more. The first occurred around 720 million years ago and is known as the Sturtian glaciation. It lasted for an almost unimaginable 57 million years, making it the longest ice age in Earth's known history. 57 million years is longer than the entire time that has passed since the dinosaurs went extinct. The world was frozen solid for longer than most people can even conceptualize. The second, called the Maren glaciation, occurred around 635 million years ago and lasted for several million more years. Together, these events define what scientists call the cryogenian period, a word that comes from the Greek for cold and birth. And as we'll see, the birth part of that name turns out to be just as important as the cold part. So what did the Earth actually look like during Snowball Earth? Imagine standing on the equator. the warmest place on the planet, and seeing nothing but ice in every direction. No open water, no waves, no sound of the ocean, just white, silent, frozen emptiness stretching from horizon to horizon. The temperature at the equator during the peak of Snowball Earth may have been around -40 degrees, similar to Antarctica today, but at a latitude where the weather is now tropical. The ice covering the ocean wasn't a thin sheet. In many places, it was hundreds of feet thick, possibly over a mile thick near the poles. The weight of it was immense. The silence of it would have been absolute. No weather systems, as we know them, could have formed, because weather requires open water and temperature contrasts to drive it. The hydrological cycle, the evaporation and rainfall that moves water around the planet, was almost completely shut down. There was no rain over most of the Earth's surface, just cold, dry, motionless air above an endless plain of ice. The ice covering the Snowball Earth oceans may have been thick enough in places to drive a car on, for millions of years at a stretch. And yet life was there the whole time, hidden underneath, waiting. The oceans beneath the ice were dark, completely dark. No sunlight could penetrate a mile of solid ice. The photosynthetic organisms that had ruled the ocean for billions of years, the cyanobacteria and algae that converted sunlight into energy, had nowhere to go. In the open ocean, far from any hydrothermal vents, life as it had existed was essentially impossible. The atmosphere during Snowball Earth was equally hostile. With the weathering of rocks almost completely shut down by the cold, you need liquid water for weathering to work. The natural process that usually pulls CO2 out of the air had stopped. But volcanic eruptions continued, as they always do, pumping CO2 into the atmosphere year after year. With no way for the gas to be removed, it built up. But paradoxically, even as CO2 climbed, it couldn't warm the planet, because the ice was reflecting so much sunlight that the greenhouse effect couldn't overcome the albedo, the reflectivity of all that white ice. The planet was locked. Globally, sea levels dropped dramatically. With so much of the world's water locked up as ice on land and sea, the oceans shrank. The shallow coastal seas where so much of the ocean's life had been concentrated either froze solid or were left high and dry as sea levels fell. Entire marine ecosystems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build were simply gone. And yet, and this is the part of the story that still astonishes scientists, the ocean did not die. Life did not end. Something survived. Something found a way. The question of how life survived Snowball Earth is one of the most fascinating puzzles in all of biology. And the answer, as far as scientists can piece it together from the geological record, is that it survived in pockets. Small, scattered, isolated abodes where the conditions were just barely hospitable enough for living things to hang on. The most important of these abodes, almost certainly, were the hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. We talked about these in the last episode. Cracks in the sea floor where superheated water loaded with minerals pours out from the Earth's interior. These vents don't depend on sunlight. They don't depend on surface temperature. They are powered by the heat of the Earth itself. And that heat doesn't care what is happening on the surface. Even with a mile of ice above them, the vents kept flowing. The water around them stayed liquid and warm. And the communities of bacteria and archaea that clustered around them kept living, kept reproducing, kept doing what they had been doing for billions of years. These vent communities were small. They were isolated from each other by vast stretches of freezing dark water. They had none of the nutrients or sunlight that surface life depends on. But they were alive, and that, ultimately, was enough. A second type of abode may have existed in shallow coastal areas near volcanic activity. Volcanoes generate enormous amounts of heat, and in areas where volcanic islands poked through the ice, or where underwater volcanic activity kept patches of water liquid, small pools of open ocean may have persisted even at the height of the freeze. These would have been tiny, pinpricks of open water in a world of ice, but they could have served as harbours for organisms that needed sunlight to survive. There is also growing evidence that the ice covering the tropical ocean may not have been uniformly thick. In some models of Snowball Earth, the equatorial ice was thinner, perhaps only a few feet thick in places, rather than hundreds of feet. Thin enough, possibly, for some sunlight to penetrate. If that's correct, then photosynthetic life may have been able to survive in a thin layer of slushy, semi-frozen water just beneath the ice surface, eking out a living on whatever light filtered through. The organisms that survived were not the large, complex Ediacaran animals that had been flourishing before the freeze. Most of those were gone. The survivors were the toughest, most adaptable, most minimal forms of life. Bacteria, archaea, simple single-celled algae, and perhaps some very basic multicellular organisms clinging to existence in the most sheltered pockets of a frozen world. To survive in these conditions required extraordinary physiological toughness. The organisms that made it through Snowball Earth were not just lucky. They had abilities that allowed them to endure cold, darkness, nutrient deprivation, and isolation in ways that their neighbours could not. And some of their descendants are still with us. Certain bacteria alive right now, living in the ice of Antarctica and in deep sea vents, are thought to be direct descendants of the organisms that survived Snowball Earth. They have barely changed in 700 million years because the extreme environment that shaped them then is not entirely different from the extreme environments they still inhabit today. Let's talk about some of the specific survivors, because this is where the story of Snowball Earth becomes genuinely personal. These aren't just abstract organisms in a biology textbook. Some of them, or their direct descendants, are creatures you may have seen with your own eyes, or eaten for dinner, or read about in a nature documentary. They are here, right now, still living on Earth, carrying in their biology the legacy of having survived one of the most extreme events in planetary history. Let's start with the sponges. Sponges are among the simplest animals on Earth. They have no brain, no nervous system, no muscles. They are little more than a collection of cells organized around a system of channels through which they filter water to extract nutrients. They look unremarkable. And yet the genetic and fossil evidence strongly suggests that sponges, or something very close to sponges, were among the organisms that survived the Snowball Earth glaciations. They were simple enough to need very little. They could survive in cold, nutrient-poor water. They could go dormant when conditions got too extreme and revive when they improved. Sponges are still alive in every ocean on Earth today, virtually unchanged from their ancient ancestors. The next time you see a sponge, whether in an aquarium or washed up on a beach, you are looking at one of the oldest surviving animal lineages on the planet, a living link to the time before the Great Freeze. Then there are the tardigrades. These extraordinary microscopic animals, sometimes called water bears because of their plump, 8-legged bodies, are perhaps the toughest animals that have ever existed. They can survive being frozen solid, being completely dried out, being exposed to the vacuum of space, and being bombarded with radiation doses that would kill a human being many times over. They do this by entering a state called cryptobiosis, essentially switching off all biological processes and becoming, for all practical purposes, inert matter until conditions improve. Scientists believe that animals with tardigrade-like abilities were among the survivors of Snowball Earth, going dormant in the ice and reviving when the thaw came. Tardigrades themselves are still alive today, living in moss, soil, ocean sediment, and fresh water on every continent, including Antarctica. Tardigrades, microscopic animals barely visible to the naked eye, have survived every mass extinction in Earth's history, including Snowball Earth. They have been to space. They have been frozen, boiled, dried, and irradiated. They are still here. They may well outlast humanity. Stromatolites are another survivor worth highlighting. We met stromatolites in the last episode. The layered mounds built by communities of cyanobacteria that left some of the oldest fossil evidence of life on Earth. They were ancient when Snowball Earth began, and they made it through. Living stromatolites still exist today in a shallow, hypersaline lagoon called Shark Bay on the western coast of Australia. They grow incredibly slowly, just a few millimeters per year. The ones alive today are thousands of years old, and the cyanobacteria building them are essentially identical to the ones that built the stromatolites 3 billion years ago. The Nautilus is another remarkable survivor, though its story is slightly different. The Nautilus is a shelled ocean creature, a relative of squids and octopuses that first appeared around 500 million years ago and has survived every mass extinction since. Its beautiful spiral shell, divided into chambers that the animal uses to control its buoyancy, is one of the most elegant structures in nature. The Nautilus has changed so little over hundreds of millions of years that scientists call it a living fossil. While its cousins, the ammonites, went extinct along with the dinosaurs, the Nautilus quietly survived and is still swimming in the deep waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans today. And finally, perhaps the most remarkable survivors of all, the deep sea vent communities. As we discussed in the last episode, the hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor host ecosystems powered entirely by chemical energy rather than sunlight. The organisms that live there, the tube worms, the vent crabs, the chemosynthetic bacteria, are the direct descendants of the organisms that kept life going through the darkest periods of Snowball Earth. They represent an unbroken lineage of life stretching back billions of years. And they are still there, still thriving, at the bottom of every ocean on Earth. The hydrothermal vent communities alive on the ocean floor today are the direct descendants of the organisms that kept life going during Snowball Earth. In a very real sense, everything alive on Earth today, including every human being, owes its existence to those tiny communities of organisms that survived in the deep, dark water under a mile of ice 700 million years ago. The Earth could not stay frozen forever. The same geological forces that had locked it in ice were, slowly and inevitably, going to set it free. And when the thaw finally came, it came fast, and it was not gentle. The mechanism of the escape was, in a strange way, the same mechanism that had caused the freeze in the first place: carbon dioxide. While the Earth was locked in ice, the normal processes that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere had stopped. Chemical weathering requires liquid water, and there was almost none, but volcanoes kept erupting. Year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, they pumped CO2 into the atmosphere. With no way for the gas to be removed and no open ocean to absorb it, the concentration climbed and climbed and kept climbing. Scientists estimate that by the time enough CO2 had built up to begin overcoming the reflectivity of the ice, the concentration in the atmosphere may have been 300 to 400 times higher than it is today. Today's CO2 levels are causing significant global warming. The CO2 levels at the end of Snowball Earth would have been extraordinary, a greenhouse effect of almost unimaginable intensity. When it reached the tipping point, the result was rapid. The greenhouse effect overwhelmed the reflectivity of the ice. Temperatures began to rise. The ice at the edges started to melt. As open ocean was exposed, it absorbed more heat because dark water absorbs far more sunlight than white ice. That caused more melting, which exposed more dark water, which absorbed more heat. It was the same runaway feedback loop that had frozen the planet, now running in reverse, and it ran just as fast. The thaw of a Snowball Earth event may have taken as little as a few thousand years, possibly less. In geological terms, that is essentially instantaneous. The planet went from completely frozen to extremely warm in what amounts to a moment. And the conditions it swung to were not just warm, they were, by modern standards, ferociously hot. With CO2 levels hundreds of times higher than normal and a planet rapidly absorbing heat after millions of years of reflecting it, temperatures after Snowball Earth may have climbed to 50 or 60 degrees Celsius at the equator. Temperatures that would feel like standing in a hot oven. The ocean surface would have been warm as bathwater across much of the globe. The difference between the peak of the freeze and the peak of the thaw was perhaps 80 to 90 degrees of global average temperature, the most extreme climate swing in Earth's history. The meltwater that poured off the continents was loaded with minerals and nutrients that had been locked in the ice for tens of millions of years. It rushed into the ocean in torrents, carrying iron, phosphorus, and other chemical building blocks that life desperately needed. For organisms that had been struggling to survive on minimal resources in isolated pockets, this sudden flood of nutrients was like a starting gun. At the same time, the high CO2 levels were being rapidly pulled back down as liquid water returned to the continents and chemical weathering restarted. The atmosphere stabilized. The extreme heat faded. And the ocean, flooded with nutrients, warming, and lit by full sunlight for the first time in tens of millions of years, was about to become the most productive it had been since before the freeze began. The period immediately following the end of Snowball Earth is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the ocean. The surviving organisms, bacteria, archaea, simple algae, sponges, and whatever other simple animals had made it through, suddenly found themselves in an ocean that was warm, nutrient-rich, and flooded with sunlight. The populations that had been bottlenecked into tiny, isolated shelters began to expand with extraordinary speed. The genetic evidence from modern organisms suggests that many of the lineages alive today trace their origins to this exact period, the aftermath of the last Snowball Earth glaciation, around 635 million years ago. It was as if the freeze had cleared the board, wiping out most of the complex life that had existed before, and the thaw had set everything up for a fresh start. The ocean was, in a sense, reset, and what grew back was different from what had been there before. The Ediacaran organisms, those strange, flat, frond-like creatures we talked about at the beginning of this episode, reappeared and diversified in the warm post-glacial ocean. The fossil record from this period shows a burst of new forms and new body plans appearing in quick succession. It was not yet the dramatic explosion of animal life that would come in the Cambrian period, that was still about 100 million years away. The post-Snowball ocean was the rehearsal for the Cambrian explosion. The chemistry of the ocean itself changed dramatically after the thaw. The meltwater flooding off the continents brought enormous quantities of calcium and other minerals into the sea. For the first time, the ocean had the chemical ingredients available in large enough quantities for organisms to build hard shells and skeletons from. This was a crucial development, because hard shells are not just protection. They are also the things that get preserved as fossils. The explosion of shelled organisms in the period following Snowball Earth is part of why the fossil record suddenly becomes so much richer. More things were leaving behind traces. The ocean was becoming legible to science in a way it hadn't been before. One of the most significant chemical changes in the post-Snowball ocean was the increase in available oxygen, both in the water and in the atmosphere. The cyanobacteria and algae that had survived the freeze went into overdrive in the warm, nutrient-rich post-glacial seas. They reproduced explosively, and as they did, they pumped oxygen into the water and air at rates higher than had been seen before. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere climbed to levels that could, for the first time, support the sustained activity of large, complex animals that needed not just a little oxygen, but a lot of it. This oxygenation of the post-Snowball ocean is thought to be one of the key triggers for the Cambrian explosion. For hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen levels in the ocean had been high enough to support simple organisms, but not quite high enough to sustain the energy demands of complex animals with active lifestyles. Animals that hunt, swim fast, build elaborate structures, and run complex nervous systems. After Snowball Earth, for the first time, the oxygen was there, and complex animal life was waiting to take advantage of it. There is a beautiful irony in this story. The event that almost destroyed all life on Earth, that froze the ocean solid and pushed surviving organisms to the absolute edge of existence, may have been the very thing that made complex animal life possible. The crisis created the conditions for everything that followed. Without Snowball Earth, there may have been no Cambrian explosion. Without the Cambrian explosion, there may have been no fish, no amphibians, no reptiles, no mammals. No us. Snowball Earth, the most devastating climate catastrophe in the history of the planet, may have been directly responsible for the conditions that led to the evolution of complex animal life, and ultimately to human beings. The disaster was also the opportunity. The evidence for Snowball Earth comes from rocks, and reading that evidence has been one of the great detective stories of modern geology. For most of the 20th century, the idea that the entire Earth had once been frozen solid was considered too extreme to be taken seriously. Then, in the 1990s, an American geologist named Joseph Kirschvink put together a compelling case for the hypothesis, and since then, the evidence has only grown stronger. The most striking evidence comes from glacial deposits, the distinctive marks that glaciers leave on the rocks they grind over. Glaciers drag boulders and grit across the bedrock beneath them, leaving characteristic scratches and gouges called striations. They also deposit a chaotic mixture of boulders, gravel, and fine rock flour called tillite. Both of these signatures are distinctive and unmistakable, and geologists have found them in rocks that are 700 million years old, on every continent on Earth, in locations that, at the time those rocks were formed, were at or near the equator. Finding glacial deposits at the equator is extraordinary. Today, glaciers only exist near the poles and at very high altitudes. The idea that glaciers were grinding across equatorial regions 700 million years ago, regions that today are hot tropical environments, was initially met with enormous skepticism. But the magnetic evidence preserved in the rocks confirmed it. Rocks record the direction of the Earth's magnetic field when they form, which tells us the latitude at which they were deposited. The glacial rocks from 700 million years ago were formed at low latitudes. There is no other explanation that fits the data. Additional evidence comes from the chemistry of the rocks, the layers of iron-rich sediment that built up on the seafloor during and after the glaciation. The same type of sediment we see in the ancient oceans of 2.5 billion years ago tell us that the ocean was oxygen depleted for extended periods, consistent with a frozen, shut-down ocean with no photosynthesis taking place at the surface. And immediately above the glacial deposits, in rocks from the same period, geologists find what they call cap carbonates, thick layers of carbonate rock that precipitated rapidly from ocean water that was suddenly flooded with calcium and CO2 as the ice melted. These cap carbonates are some of the most dramatic signatures of rapid climate change in the entire geological record. The science of Snowball Earth is not settled. There are still significant debates about how complete the freeze was, whether the entire ocean froze solid or whether thin stretches of open water persisted near the equator, in what some scientists call a slush ball Earth model rather than a full snowball. There are debates about how many glaciation events there were, how long each one lasted, and exactly what triggered the thaws. But the broad outlines are now well established. The Earth froze. The ocean nearly died. Life held on in the margins. And what came after was unlike anything that had come before. It would be easy to think of Snowball Earth as ancient history, something that happened so long ago that it has no relevance to the world we live in today. But the connections between that frozen world and our own are deeper than they might appear. The most direct connection is the one we've already talked about. The fact that Snowball Earth appears to have been a necessary precondition for complex animal life. Every animal alive on Earth today, including every human being, is here in part because of what happened 700 million years ago. The freeze filtered the gene pool. It pushed surviving organisms to extremes that forced new adaptations. It created the chemical and atmospheric conditions that allowed complex life to flourish. The crisis was the catalyst. There is also a more sobering connection. The same feedback loops that drove Snowball Earth, the relationship between ice, reflectivity, greenhouse gases, and temperature forms, are the same feedback loops that climate scientists study today. The albedo feedback, where melting ice exposes dark water that absorbs more heat, causing more melting, is one of the most important and worrying mechanisms in current climate projections for the Arctic. The relationship between CO2 and global temperature that we observe in the Snowball Earth record is the same relationship that underlies modern climate science. The physics hasn't changed, only the direction of the feedback has. Snowball Earth also reminds us of something that is easy to forget when we think about climate change on human timescales. The Earth's climate is not a stable, fixed thing. It has always changed. It has been far warmer than today and far colder. It has been ice-free and completely frozen. The relatively stable, moderate climate of the past 10,000 years, the climate in which all of human civilization developed, is not the default state of the planet. It is a brief window of unusual stability, and it is one that we depend on far more than we typically acknowledge. And finally, Snowball Earth is a story about resilience, about the extraordinary tenacity of life in the face of conditions that should, by any reasonable measure, have ended it completely. The ocean froze, the surface world died, and in the dark, in the cold, in the margins, in the vents, life endured. Not because it was invincible, but because it was adaptable and because it had time. The lesson of Snowball Earth is not that life is fragile. It is that life is stubbornly, relentlessly, almost offensively persistent, and that given half a chance, it will find a way. The ocean that exists today, the ocean that covers 71% of this planet and sustains all life on Earth, has been frozen solid more than once. It has been dark and cold and almost entirely dead, and it came back. Every single time it came back. The creatures that live in it today carry that history in their DNA. The sponges on the reef, the bacteria in the deep sea vents, the tardigrades in a handful of ocean sediment, the nautilus drifting in the Pacific dark. They are all survivors, in the most literal sense of the word. In our next episode, we follow the ocean into one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of our planet. The story of an ocean so vast and so rich that it rivaled anything alive in the seas today. An ocean that sat at the center of the world for over 200 million years, hosted some of the most spectacular life ever to swim in any sea, and then disappeared completely, leaving behind the highest mountains on Earth, the oil fields of the Middle East, and the Mediterranean Sea as its only remnants. Until then, thank you for listening.